Hello everyone, and welcome. Are you an oddity, that rare anime fan who even now is still on the edge, wondering if they should watch Chainsaw Man? Or perhaps you've already fallen in love with it, or just dropped the entire series in utter disgust, and are just looking to hear what other people have to say about the show. In any case, you have come to the right place. Indeed, the time has come. We're now officially through the demon-slaying, breast-fondling, chainsaw-revving anime phenomenon that is Chainsaw Man, the brainchild of the insane genius that is Tatsuki Fujimoto, and has been stunningly brought to our anime viewing pleasure by none other than Studio Mappa. I can't be far off the truth saying that Chainsaw Man is the most hyped anime of the decade, and it really doesn't disappoint. Every episode is stunning, and the discussion on social media is going wilder and wilder every day, for better or for worse, up to and including the petition to remake the entire show, among other complaints. But I'll get to those a little later. But one question remains. Is it really as good as people hyped it up to be? And if so, why do they want a remake? Oh, and the usual applies. This is only about the anime and purely about the anime. I know the manga is great, I know it's critically acclaimed, I get it, we're clear. Good. Chainsaw Man is a story full of sexual tension, violence, and surprisingly enough, very little tree felling despite the obviously forestry-related name. But jokes aside, it is honestly a story that contains most, if not all, the things we as viewers generally look for in the pop culture we consume, and oh look, it appeals to the masses, myself included. It's a story about Denji, the debt-slave teenager turned demon hunter for the Yakuza since he got the greatest inheritance from his father a child could ever hope for. Crippling debt. And that is pretty much how the first episode goes, and this brings one of the major aspects of Chainsaw Man to light immediately, which is honestly a nice change of pace. It isn't slyly trying to hide the fact that it as a story includes the nasty side of people, and those very real fears the viewers might share with the characters. This incorporated into a very much supernatural tale of devils, and the fear they bring to the characters in the show creates a dynamic of something, while horrible, still familiar, for us as viewers to identify with. And if it wasn't immediately obvious, fear and conquering it is a big part of Chainsaw Man. Whereas other anime might choose something inspiring or sweet as the great unifier, Chainsaw Man goes with fear. We all fear something, no matter how hard some people might try to hide it. Well, maybe not him, but you know what I mean. It is such a base emotion that all living things have, which helps viewers identify with the characters, and not only that, fear is the very thing that makes the devil stronger. I mean, things like guns, swords, leeches, and apparently tomatoes. And speaking of everyone fearing something, the depiction of such human emotions is second to none. Now, Twitter would not agree with me on this one, but the depiction of Kobani's fear and anxiety-induced panic attack was one of the best illustrations of this in an anime form ever, and this is not the only example of things like this. The portrayal of human emotions in Chainsaw Man are amazing, and the discrepancy between the characters who show such emotions and characters like Denji and Makima somehow makes them seem less human, which I'm suspecting is intentional. Now, if you're a returning viewer, you might have noticed by now that this video is sort of lacking that general story overview I usually give, and that is because I'm trying my hardest to avoid any spoilers in this. But for the story as is, it mostly follows the usual shonen trends familiar from shows like My Hero Academia. And yes, it is listed as a shonen on MAL, so that's what I'm going with. Speaking of those shonen trends, while the highs are mostly what you'd expect from the genre and are in that regard predictable, by this I mean highs like battle hype and the overall victory of the good guys, among other generally found in shonen. But for Chainsaw Man, the lows is where the mystery lies. While shows like the aforementioned My Hero Academia has the usual shonen lows of relatively minor setbacks and some deaths that aren't really significant in the grand scheme of things, beyond reminding the viewers and the protagonist that yes, people do die, Chainsaw Man just turns everything up to 11. Sure, the good guys win a lot, but the way they get there is far off from the usual shonen friendship is magic, since Chainsaw adds that extra line of and magic is heresy, causing the victory to often come in ways you'd not expect, or in a way that is far removed from fitting their title of the good guys. But then again, you will be hard-pressed to find the usually altruistically good guy protagonist normally present in shonen. Instead, you get Denji, a misfit who has had a hard life turned demon slayer for the public safety division, a horny kid that just wants to touch some boobs, and who has a heart of chainsaws and a personality to match. Sure, Denji's story has a few of those, well, that's convenient moments, but the way they're presented don't feel like just empty conveniences that are explained half-heartedly. The more the story progresses, the more they just become a natural part of it. None of these moments stand out anywhere near as much as, let's say, Nezuko randomly sleeping for 2 years since it was convenient. But since I already brought up Denji, as well as the somewhat unorthodox approach to the good aligned characters in Chainsaw Man, I think it's a good time to cover a few of the characters briefly as well, since they are rather interesting, and as I already said, none of them are truly good, just shades of grey with people exploiting others to achieve their own goals. admittedly some of them doing worse things than others, but as a whole Chainsaw Man isn't afraid to show that bad people do bad things, and even good people can do morally questionable things for the sake of their own goals, no matter how much Twitter gets angry about it. Take Power for example. She's a fiend or a devil in human form who allied with the Public Safety Division when presented with the option to do so. Admittedly, given the option to either die or join was probably not a very hard one, given that she's the kind of character to only ever look out for number one, giving very little thought to anyone else. If they help her achieve her goals, cool, she tolerates them, or if they're a cat she might even care for them, but for Power, power always comes first. Although slowly she does open up a bit to her companions, Aki and Denji, not to a point where I'd call them friends in the traditional sense of the word, but at least they seem a little less like tools for her. I mean, Aki does provide her with sustenance, and Denji fights alongside her and even helps her save a cat, even if it's only to cop a feel. Out of the trio, Aki is probably the closest to a character which you might expect to see in a show like this. A young man set on revenge against a foe far beyond himself, but the way he goes about it is a bit off the usual mark. Sure, self-sacrifice is a common theme in anime, but not quite to this degree. His seemingly complete and utter disregard for his own life is somewhat chilling. The man is even more consumed by revenge than Sasuke ever was. I mean, Sasuke had this childlike teenage edge vengeance in his mind, but Aki's is a cold-burning, all-consuming hatred. Think Levi but lacking the godly combat abilities to back up that revenge. I mean, Aki is good, but the contracts he makes to boost his abilities and their cost is so steep that it feels hard to even begin to identify with him most of the time. But thankfully from time to time he does follow his human impulses, helping a little in this regard. Then we have characters like Makima, who, well, just isn't a good character, as in she isn't good aligned. She has her own goals that seem to match those of the Public Safety Division, but there are plenty of hints that this is not fully the case, and the way she does things is probably the furthest thing from being a good character of all of them, to a point where she feels more like an antagonist whose purpose for the time being just happens to align with the good guys. Honestly, there isn't a boring character anywhere in Chainsaw Man. Sure, I don't like all of them equally, and some we as viewers haven't really gotten to know that well, while others have had their time in the limelight cut tragically short. But from their personalities, they are all solid and interesting throughout. And so is their character design, at least to a degree. The characters in Chainsaw Man take mostly human forms, with the more demonic amongst them having some rather quirky appearances. In a good way, that is. The character design is grounded, but still manages to remain interesting and unique throughout. Sure, there is only so much one can do with a predominantly human character, but introduce that element of mystery and you get a really interesting mix of human and something a bit more. And then there are the eyes, betraying that something perhaps demonic is bubbling under the surface for some of them. Since we're on the topic of graphical design, it is as good a time as any to talk about the general style and the animation of Chainsaw Man. Now, for me, the show looks good. The animation follows that general style of the manga to a degree. It's only natural that there are things missing from some shots, and some things are different or lacking in that meticulous detail, but that is the price to pay when animating, well, almost anything really. Now, there have been rumblings about the show's animation not really fitting all that well into Fujimoto's style, but given that the man himself said that he was fine with them ignoring the original style and doing it in a style they wanted, I can hardly complain. To repeat myself, the show looks good. It isn't eye-wateringly stunning in its fights execution like, say, Demon Slayer or Mob Psycho, or a gem in animation mastery in, well, anything really. There is tons of CG animation present, but it isn't crude and it fits the general flow perfectly well. And at its best, it does what CG is supposed to do and lends that natural fluidity of motion to the fight scenes, and even at its worst, it doesn't really stick out. Admittedly, I'm one of those unfortunate individuals who saw Berserk 2016, and almost nothing looks bad when compared to that travesty, so take this verdict with a pinch of salt. Especially since I know a lot of anime fans have a deep-rooted, seething hatred for CG animation, regardless of its quality, but all in all, the animation and graphical execution of Chainsaw Man, from the character appearances to the fights and just general banter between the characters, looks pretty damn good. But now about those complaints I mentioned in the beginning. In case you weren't aware, there's currently an active petition going on to remake Chainsaw Man with a different director. I won't really dive in too much detail about this, but the gist of it is that some of the fans of the original manga are unhappy with practically every aspect of the anime, from the aforementioned director's vision and take on the manga original, to the casting of some characters, predominantly Denji, all the way to the music, general sound design, voice acting in general, and the aforementioned graphical delivery. Now, what I think about these accusations and demands should be quite clear by now, given the opinions I've laid out in this video already, but what I wanted to mention in particular is that this is by no means a massive surprise to me. I mean, we've all at least heard of the manga reader's superiority complex many a time, and while I do mostly agree that manga is the better way to experience the author's original vision, people have to keep in mind that two different creators will never deliver the same product, even with the same story, and we as consumers are all the richer for different adaptations. So long as those adaptations aren't Promised Neverland Season 2, but I hope you see what I mean by this. Would I complain if the anime got a remake? Probably not, but I don't think it needs one either. Even if I do agree with the point about the music and sound effects. This is about the background music and the fight sounds, mind you, not the opening or the endings, which were all top-notch. But as the petition for a remake details, the background stuff was rather uninspiring. I feel like I'm just repeating myself from one video to another at this point, but the music and sound effects were kind of just there, drowned somewhere in the background of everything else. But I will also say that this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes better is the enemy of good enough, and a show doesn't always need an aspect that sticks out with its superiority. If anything, it has the chance to make an otherwise solid execution somewhere else look worse than it actually is. But now, conclusion time. I was never super hyped for Chainsaw Man to begin with, since I'm still quite new to the genius of Tatsuki Fujimoto, and as such I wasn't quite sure what to expect, even if the hype on social media was rather compelling. To my rather tame expectations, Chainsaw Man delivered a solid performance that easily cleared the seasonal average, but it didn't quite soar all the way to be included in my all-time favourites in a similar vein to shows like Summertime Rendering, Call of the Night and Edge Runners did this year, and as such I do get the disappointment of some of the fans of the franchise. The show had its moments, but the times it had me sitting on the edge of my seat were quite few and far between. Then again, nowhere was I disappointed by what was on screen, and I was always excited for the next episode. But to give it a general placement on my list of shows, I'd say Chainsaw Man is a solid 7, maybe 7.5 out of 10, landing it somewhere in the same bracket with things like One Punch Man Season 2 and My Hero Academia. A solid performance throughout, but not reaching any new heights, which, given the astronomical hype, I was a bit surprised by. Chainsaw Man is a shonen that I still think is a seinen that isn't afraid to explore the darker side of the human psyche, with fear being one of its driving unifiers, and all of the show's characters being some shades of grey on the scale of how much of a goody two-shoes they are. It is a show where there are only demons, some more obviously demonic while others donning human clothes, and acting accordingly when it doesn't interfere with their own goals. It's a dark story on some pretty dark topics, but it's still well balanced with humour and the general level of chaotic energy. And lastly, before I go, leave your thoughts in the comments below. Did you agree or disagree with my verdict? Are you an avid fan of the anime adaptation, or do you perhaps support the remake petition? If you like this, like it, dislike if you didn't, subscribe for more weeby content, go enjoy some of my other videos, and check the links in the description if you want to engage with me outside of YouTube. With this, I have been Cheese, and hope to see you next time with more anime goodness. Ta-ta for now.